Thanks to all of you for coming to the Center for Global Development today for this interesting discussion of the tension. The tension between, I think that sound effect was appropriate. When I say the word tension, I like to always have that sound effect come up. For the tension that might exist between the need to deliver humanitarian care when there's an outbreak as serious as the recent Ebola outbreak, and the need to actually learn what works to address that outbreak, especially in the case where the outbreak is of a disease which is emerging, for which a therapeutic does not exist, and even a vaccine does not exist. In those cases, the need for learning is really quite acute. But how can that need for learning be accommodated when the humanitarian need is so great? So our speakers today who will be addressing that point are the leaders of a team at the National Academy of Sciences who produced a report just recently published on the topic of implementing clinical trials during epidemics. And I'm going to turn over the podium now to the co-chair of that team, who is Dr. Gerald Keusch. He's currently a professor at Boston University, and he's also managing a very important and exciting institution that's recently been created there where one could do research on emerging and dangerous diseases. This is an institution which we desperately need in the United States, and he's working hard to try to bring that to fruition. He and his co-presenter, David Peters, will be talking for about 15 minutes each, and then we'll have a panel discussion during which we're going to welcome Dr. Carrie Teicher from the Médecins Sans Frontières, the humanitarian group that actually did more Ebola care and saved more Ebola lives than any other single group during the Ebola outbreak. And also Jeremy Conondike, who's here with us at CGD and who supported the United States effort to control the Ebola epidemic from his position as Director of Emergency, the Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance at USAID during that period. So now I'll turn it over to Jerry.
Thanks, Meet. And my thanks as well to everybody for participating, and for those of you who are watching remotely. We are really grateful for your input. I'm representing, and with David as well, representing a committee that was formed at the National Academy of Medicine to look at the issue of doing clinical research when there is an epidemic. And there were a multiplicity of issues that were present at the start of the outbreak. And so critically, as Mead said, and particularly for Ebola, there was actually very little that was clearly known about how to manage a patient with Ebola, just plain clinical support. And there were no therapeutics or vaccines that had gone through human clinical trials and shown to be both effective and safe to use. So that's sort of the genesis of where this committee began. I'll tell you a little bit about that. What David and I are hoping to do today is to hear from you and get some of your thoughts, and particularly around two of the questions. I don't think we need to delve into the technical aspects of statistics and study design, but how do you, in fact, integrate research into an epidemic response? I think we're past the time when we'd say, does that need to happen? I think we now know clearly that has to happen. The question is how. And then secondly, how do you create the overall governance and leadership structure that can address this kind of an issue? And what might be the criteria? So I thought it was worthwhile to back up just a little bit to some fundamentals of how do you develop new drugs and vaccines. And the same thing could be said for diagnostic tests, except that the issue of human safety is not really as significant as it is for drugs and vaccines. So first you need the science. You need to figure out what's a target for a drug, what's a target for an immune response in a host, what's a molecule in a pathogen that would be useful for that. Same thing would apply to diagnostics. And now you have to fund that R&D. A lot of that is funded, of this upstream basic research is funded by public money. The development process is something that's done by industry, and particularly in this country. But you need to determine ultimately whether these things work in humans. We start with animals. And the Food and Drug Administration has often applied a 2-animal rule where you need to show both safety and efficacy in 2 different species. And that's in part because response to, say, a single drug or a single vaccine may differ according to what species you're in. And showing it works in 2 animals doesn't say it works in humans or that is actually safe in humans. So when you have favorable data from animal studies, you can get regulatory approval to start a phase 1 trial in humans, which is a small study. It's usually a dosing study looking for safety, and primarily. These are not people who are at risk of the infection or might need treatment. If you can show that it's safe in a smaller study, you can move on to a larger study which looks at both safety in a larger population, as well as an indication that these perform as you expected, that a vaccine will produce an immune response that you think will be protective. And then ultimately, if all of that goes well and something is licensed and introduced, phase 3 trials are larger scale where you can really begin to look at the efficacy and get much more safety data. And most of the candidates that enter into the process fall off for one reason or another before you get to phase 3 and even the results of the phase 3. So one of the questions that might be asked is, why is research during Ebola different than other things that we've done in the past? So measles, cholera, dengue. Well, the first thing is that high mortality, no proven treatment, experimental human infection models are not possible. You can do that with cholera because we could treat you if you develop the disease, and that's been done, human models of cholera to develop vaccines. For this kind of an infection like Ebola, an outbreak is the only opportunity for a human trial. Measles, we know, already has a highly safe and highly effective vaccine. Cholera, we know how to treat, and antibiotics can eliminate the organism and shorten the clinical course, and there's now already a cheap and effective vaccine. Not yet for dengue, but it's not difficult to conduct trials during dengue. There are large numbers of patients all the time, and dengue is typically not a lethal disease. So Ebola and diseases like it stand out as different. So why do you need to do research during an Ebola outbreak? Well, the first is collecting basic clinical data to learn how to best care for infected patients. So I'm a physician. I look at what we do as a coin with 2 sides. One side is taking care of people. The other side is learning how to do it better. And those, to me, are inseparable. Constant learning is part of the model of being in the healthcare profession. To assess an investigational drug vaccine for safety and efficacy in humans, because animal models in general do not reliably predict the human response. So you actually have to go to the human trials to show that it works and it's safe. If you had good vaccines, you'd actually be able to use them to enhance a public health approach to limit an outbreak. and use it potentially to prevent a future outbreak. And when it fails to prevent an outbreak and you have people who are sick, you need to be able to treat them and treat them effectively. And the addition of drugs to the higher standard of clinical care may be a significant improvement in survival and reduction in consequences. So this part of advancing medical knowledge in general and patient care, and this is what the FDA says about clinical trials and why they're needed. It's when clinicians don't know if or how well a new approach will work in people. If there are several, which of them are better? Are there subpopulations in which one or another of a treatment will work? And what's the context? What's the setting? You need that kind of information before you can approve and license something and manufacture it and distribute it and use it. And to rapidly as possible expand access to promising new approaches. We say that clinical research is not necessarily for the person who is involved in that clinical trial. It's certainly for the future. It is potentially available to individuals who are themselves suffering from the disease if the progress can be made and shown to be beneficial. So to sum up the clinical research that was done during the outbreak, we learned very little definitively. And because of that, the National Academies were asked to assess the trials and recommend improvements during future emergencies. Our sponsors were three parts of the Department of Health and Human Services, from the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, the FDA, and the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. The Academy created a 16-member committee from the US, from Europe, from Africa. We had 3 public workshops. We had 6 closed committee meetings, a very comprehensive literature review, conference calls, email exchanges, and incredibly extensive external and internal review process before the report was issued. Briefly, the context of the outbreak. It was actually, it's thought that patient 0 was a 2-year-old in Guinea, in rural Guinea, who became ill towards the end of December 2013. By the middle of January, the trail of cases from that child to relatives and some of the healthcare providers resulting in similar kind of death was recognized as unusual. This was a cluster of an unusual something. And the medical officer out in the boonies in Guinea notified the Ministry of Health. Something unusual is going on. Ministry sent a team and investigated, and they came to the conclusion it was cholera. Only because diarrhea was a part of it, and they had had outbreaks of cholera in the past. I can tell you clinically, cholera should not have been on their mind because the diarrhea was bloody, and that's not what happens in cholera. So they did not identify it, and it wasn't until the latter part of February that the ministry said, this is behaving differently. We're a little bit worried this may be something different. And they asked MSF, which was doing work in the country, to come and take a look. MSF's response was immediate and strong, and they said, this looks like a hemorrhagic fever. They obtained samples, sent it to France, and the diagnosis was made in the middle of March. Lost 2 months from the point at which an outbreak was identified. And that was really important because at that point already it had crossed the borders into the 2 contiguous countries, Sierra Leone and Liberia. MSF now came in and built an enterprise to take care of patients. And they quickly recognized that this was out of control. It was different from anything they had ever done with Ebola. And they kept saying, this is different, this is different. WHO, at least influenced by past experience with Ebola, which are smaller, contained outbreaks that are relatively easily controlled, did not recognize, did not agree with MSF. They declared this as a moderate event, which in their language is level 2, which can be supported by the country office and regional office supervision. It didn't get the big global recognition that it need. And it wasn't until August that the highest level of concern, this public health emergency of international concern, was declared by WHO. Now the international response started to kick in, and only then was the possibility of doing clinical trials appreciated. And now 6 months have gone by, and there were thousands of infected people, which had never been seen before in an Ebola outbreak. So ultimately, there were over 28,000 infected, over 11,000 who died. At the beginning, there were no approved vaccines or treatments. And when in August and September of 2014, when they started thinking about clinical trials, things started to come out of the woodwork. And when you eliminated the crazy things, there were still about 20 potential candidates that could have been studied. This is a timeline of the outbreak in terms of cases. And so the three lines here are the three countries, the three target countries. So here's the middle of March. Ebola is declared. Here's when this international concern was raised by WHO. Now the outbreak response starts to kick in. It's sluggish, and it's several months later before the outbreak starts to come down. The trials that were done, this is the therapeutic trials, these are the vaccine trials. You can see they were all initiated when the outbreak was really coming under control. There were a few cases, and that had major implications for the results that were gained. And here are the results. There were 5 therapeutic trials. None were conclusive that this works and is safe. One of those trials suggests efficacy, but it's not going to be sufficient for convincing a regulatory agency that this is okay.
So
and of
clarification, was any of the trials conclusive that the therapy was not safe or not effective?
There weren't, so the initial indication was that the therapeutics were not contributing to mortality. But safe in the context in which a regulatory agency would want to see, not at that point.
No evidence.
No evidence, not from the nature of the data. And the vaccine trials, one candidate had a probable protective effect, although it got publicized last December as 100% effective. The problem with that conclusion, from our point of view, is that the most appropriate statistical analysis was not applied. When you apply that analysis, still effective, the estimate was about 65% efficacy, but the confidence around that estimate spanned 0. So it could be coincidental that it looks like it's effective. It still could be not effective. So it looks promising. We may have one promising intervention, a therapeutic, and one promising vaccine, but they still need to go through the necessary clinical research, which in Ebola is really going to be the next outbreak. And the next outbreak is unlikely to be as big as this one, which means that we really have to be prepared to move in as quickly as possible. So the clinical trials that were implemented here sort of in January, so you go from, say, September, October, when they started to think about doing something, getting it approved, getting the logistics. The rapidity with which this happened was remarkable, unprecedented, and not fast enough. And so that's a key lesson, is that we've got to be even more effective and efficient and faster. The conditions on the ground, and Carrie may talk about that, were really chaotic. And because of that, if you focused on the people who were sick and dying and their families who were at risk, that was sitting right in front of you as something of importance. Why are we going to get involved in trying to do research, particularly when you had to deal with patients in protective equipment under ambient conditions that made it very difficult to provide care, let alone having investigators there, collecting the data? I mean, there were a whole set of issues. There was no consensus on what to study or how to organize it. There was very limited experience with Ebola. They really didn't have recognized Ebola, although it turns out now from epidemiological evidence that the virus was in fact in West Africa. It may have been appearing and unrecognized, and unrecognized is unknown. There were real big mistakes in how the messaging was done. There was a failure to engage the community in the process. Some of these experimental therapies were used in expatriates that were evacuated from West Africa who had contracted Ebola, taking care of patients. They seemed to do pretty well. Mortality was very low, and suddenly there was this magic medicine, a magic serum that was being given to the foreigners but not to the Africans, which fed into all of the conspiracy theories that were rampant in West Africa, lack of trust, and their history of civil conflict. And then the research groups themselves were poorly coordinated and competitive to get their product into a trial. There was no mechanism to triage which are the most important things to do and how to do it. And that was particularly true as the cases dwindled, as the epidemic was being controlled. So some key messages from the report. Research is necessary, and the best way to ensure that it can be done under these kinds of circumstances is to integrate it into epidemic response. We think these can be organized to work together. Question is, how do you do that? That's the challenge now. Questions were raised about the ethics of doing randomized trials. The analysis of the report is clear. It is both ethical and it proved to be feasible to do randomized trial. What you needed to do was to prepare the community through engagement to be able to participate. And if the research is going to be useful at all, it has to be scientifically rigorous and designed in a way that would produce useful information. This kind of planning and organizing begins before an outbreak occurs. That's right now. And it requires both international and national coordination and collaboration. And across everything, local community participation in the process is absolutely essential, not only during the epidemic, but before the next one happens.
So are you arguing that it's essential only for ethical reasons, or you can't do the research without it?
You can't do the research without it, but it also is, the community is a part of the effort. So excluding them makes it elite and separate and creates adverse conditions to trying to do it. There was little capacity to do clinical research, but the key message, a key part of our message is that we don't want to separate the research establishment. We don't want a first world research agency going into Liberia and building a beautiful study ward in a decrepit hospital where the level of clinical care is awful. It has to be across the spectrum of health provision, the public health response, and the clinical research. These need to be linked together. Investment is needed now to start moving towards these kinds of prepared processes. And this engagement, coordination among the research and development agencies to cover that whole broad agenda is critical. And how do you get the optimal leadership to do this? It may be different if you're trying to do clinical research than it is if you're trying to do a rapid clinical intervention. So that's the setup of my remarks, of this broader picture of what was going on, what are the needs, the slice of the response that's clinical research, and why it's necessary. And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to David Peters. David is at Hopkins and is the chair of the Department of International Health, and really has great expertise on these issues. And he's going to try to raise some of the questions about how do we go forward, how do we create the collaboration and the leadership to do it.
Oh, thanks, Jerry. So thanks for inviting me, Mead, and people at CGD. I'm very happy to be here, and I want to follow up on the points that Jerry made in terms of the governance and leadership aspects of the work. And I'm going to start with the international health regulations. And really, the IHR, this is a legacy that we have. The legal regulations go back to the 1850s. It's something that WHO inherited when it was founded, and they revise from time to time, and it's really about setting the conditions to have international protection and response to epidemic diseases for purposes of public health and trade. And the difficulty is being that they have been not working very well. And it's fine when there's no major outbreak, but the problem is that it happens from time to time. And what we saw here in the failure of the IHRs was basically, not just the inability to have the surveillance and the rapid response, but really in the whole preparation side of things. WHO is tasked with preparing countries. Countries are obligated by legal agreement. 196 countries have signed up to this to have the capacities. Very few of them are. In fact, they were supposed to be in place by 2012, and none of the West African countries are in that position. I think Liberia was the first one even to do an assessment of its capacity in 2017, and still has a long way to go. So clearly this is a problem with capabilities, but it does have on its side, clear governance structures led by WHO. It's really government to government, but it can call on other experts and organizations using this roster of experts and emergency committee and review committee. It was last revised in 2005 after the SARS epidemic. And so hopefully it will be further revised, and it certainly is an area where we need to put a lot of emphasis in terms of making it work better. But it doesn't work in large part not just because of capacity constraints nationally and at WHO, but also because of lack of enforcement, poor public accountability, and in fact, never has there been a mandate and governance structures to incorporate research. So research has not been part of this, and what we're seeing now is this growing consensus that it needs to be part of the epidemic response, and we need to find ways to bridge research and practice into the effort of epidemics. And so how do we do this going forward? And this is really what I wanted to talk about in terms of this work in progress, really. So how do we fill this governance gap? In terms of moving forward with leadership and governance around putting research into epidemics. So obviously governance is a social construct. It's highlighted in the Sustainable Development Goals in terms of need for international, effective, accountable, inclusive institutions. The issue around health research and epidemic response is that these are really broad, multi-stakeholder networks. So they have very different interests, capabilities, and mandates, and very different asymmetric levels of power. And so we really need to have a governance model that actually recognizes and addresses these type of concerns. And so we need to learn how to do that. Now, one thing that the report did is highlighted the broad set of stakeholders involved in the epidemic response. Governments, national governments, but many different agencies, not just ministries of health, foreign affairs, and president's offices, but the regulatory agencies, research, and public health agencies are critical and often not talking to each other, and why you might actually have different designs as things move on in terms of clinical designs for research during it. Obviously, WHO has a major role. World Bank, UNICEF was involved. Humanitarian organizations were certainly feeling at the front lines and have played a critical role, MSF being most prominent, but others as well. I think over 70 different humanitarian NGOs were involved in the outbreak. And obviously other groups related to research, foundations, professional associations, and industry. Pharmaceuticals and diagnostic companies, industry is involved, and civil society. All of these are critical stakeholders. So what we did in the report was we proposed a type of governance structure for basically a set of functions and principles that need to be adhered to. So the principles around inclusive, autonomous, and independent organizations, and leading with, well, we call it during the inter-epidemic planning period, but of course there's always an epidemic going on, but between major crises, we need to be better prepared. And what's needed is really bringing together all of these types of stakeholders, and not just the government to government and occasional sets of selective involvement that goes on typically, but involving those full sets, including what has been difficult, bringing community representatives, actually dealing with industry, academia, and humanitarian organizations. And the purpose of this group is really to do things like How do you prioritize what are the pathogens, what are the research that needs to be done, doing the research before that, bringing up the candidates. Being able to identify standard types of research designs, being able to identify standard agreements, all the things that slow down research when you have to respond quickly, but also to identify the key players, the actors who can be there who can be called upon for this next group, in particular, this rapid response work group, we've called it, the R3W. Sounds like oil, but it actually is, quite slick. But the idea is that when an outbreak is emerging, that you have people who have expertise in that specific pathogen, those viruses. You need that kind of expertise. You need to be able to bring in those who can do the regulatory work, the designs, the ethics, and you need to be community representative. So we propose that you need to have this kind of group that gets brought on, and you have to have that roster and the standard operating procedures ahead of time. So these are the two kinds of functions and sets of organizations that we think need to be set up. This coalition and the rapid response group. And we looked at what's happening in current models. We looked at what WHO does. We looked at what the Global Health Security Agenda does and what this organization called the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, CEPI, does. And none of them are perfect fits. There are huge problems with all of them in terms of capacity, but we really like the approach that CEPI is doing in terms of bringing the full set of stakeholders, particularly around bringing this international coalition of stakeholders. So what we're proposing is we don't have the perfect model right now. We have to move towards something like that. We may never have a perfect model, but we have to move towards something that brings in the full set of stakeholders and has these capabilities. And so as we move forward, we have to think of, what are the key issues in terms of establishing some of those governance arrangements. So what we've done beyond the report is to think about a working group thinking about what are the things that need to be involved. Well, we need to have among stakeholders clarity of goals and recognize that there are differences in commonality of stakeholders. We need to look at the different stakeholders' ideologies, power, and accountability, and how you bring them in, and so that you set up governance that addresses these issues. I think one of the things about global health architecture is that you have a really unruly melange of characters, and we tend to go at it with a bit of sort of naivete or sort of this entrenched opposition to certain groups, or sort of a favoritism. Certain academics are selected. You can never have industry and WHO in the same room. These kinds of patterns we need to get over, for example. We also need to agree on when you say entrenched opposition towards certain groups, can you give an example? Yeah, well, the example I gave, it's very hard for WHO to work with industry. It's a pharmaceuticals industry in particular. And so it's difficult for them to do that. I think they also have difficulty in how do you bring in civil society organizations. I don't think it's entrenched opposition. I think it's lack of understanding of how to do it very well. So I think those are some of the barriers. And one of the big lessons of the Ebola outbreak is that you really need civil society engagement, and that's a huge part of the outbreak response. Absolutely, community engagement. Yes. That's a whole talk in itself, a whole discussion. Agreed. And then you need deliberative processes. So not just principles, but processes that account for these things: legitimacy, inclusiveness, authority, and accountability. So some of these are not new concepts, and there's a really good book by Justin Parkhurst out about the politics of evidence, which I'd recommend to you, that looks at some of these issues as well. But these are things that we should look at in the governance. Now, I have a set of questions that are really things that are on the table now that should be addressed. These are not simply rhetorical questions, although they may seem that way, but they're things that are being neglected or should be addressed. So right now, there is a group of interested parties brought together by Chatham House, but includes Wellcome, includes WHO, national governments, and there is consensus about this main thing, about bringing together collaborative, coordinated research to save people's lives during crises. So that's great. And there are probably some agreement around the goals around drug availability. But these other things about what is the research agenda, its scope, which pathogens to include. Does it include antimicrobial resistance? Does it include all the epidemiologic, the sociologic type of research that you need during an outbreak? So these are, these kind of issues around role of capacity building, what kind of accountabilities you want, and actually the sharing of benefits of costs. Who should benefit from this? This is all contested territory that should be made explicit as we develop governance arrangements. Similarly, the issue of interest, ideology, power, accountability. There are still, to this day, WHO is claiming that they're the only organization without vested interests. Well, maybe they don't have commercial interests, but everybody, of course, has interests. And they certainly are dependent financially on governments and on foundations. We have certain ideologies. Organizations have their own beliefs about what is evidence, who should own intellectual property. But there's also sort of the commitment to previous guidelines and things that you have done, whether it's a clinical guidelines or programs. You get vested interest in these things and ideologies. This issue of power is critical. Who's going to pay for what goes on and who's going to implement it? That may actually ultimately determine what gets done. And then what kind of accountabilities do you want to put in place? Recognizing that different agencies have different kinds of two-way accountabilities. So this is a serious area of inquiry that has not been systematically addressed for this issue and actually for many issues in global health governance. Working principles, yes, we have this group that's put together a so-called global coordination mechanism, really doing some good work in terms of deciding some of these mechanisms. There is a WHO blueprint for top priority pathogens that a group of scientists at their behest have prioritized, but it's not the only list. There's a list out of Edinburgh that has, I think, 39 pathogens that have potential to do this. There's a huge overlap, but there's differences in terms of how do you prioritize. Is it a strictly technical or is it a political issue as well? There's other principles they've got in terms of using evidence and broadly about accountability, but there's a number of things that aren't there in terms of how do you include stakeholders beyond government and selected people in scientific community. And these ones I've mentioned before. How do you get them to the table? Who gets to choose who's involved or not? CDC China is probably going to be the biggest investor in public health infrastructure. And if you don't have them at the table, you have to wonder if you're really having a global governance framework. Similarly, USAID has and should have roles there in terms of infrastructure capacity building. Universities and civil society, again, very clumsy in terms of how this is being done. One university right now is involved. And it's not just that it's not Hopkins, just by the way. So there are a big issue about how do you reduce conflicts of interest, accountabilities, and balance of these and how do you properly balance these? So I'd like to talk a bit about that. And it's related to these deliberative processes. Right now, there's sort of a default type of approach that governance for research should be under a single agency headed by WHO, just like the international health regulations. So one issue is, of course, whether they have the capacity for all the functions that you need, and we'll talk about that in a second. The second is, well, how do you actually avoid conflicts of interest in research? Because that's a big deal in research. The other notion is, well, governance arrangements really needs to have a distributed approach because of the wide sets of leadership in different specialized areas and the need to balance accountability. We don't really know how to do that, but we have to find our way how to get around that. Again, both of them will have issues around these questions of legitimacy, authority, and accountability. But now even if you have the mandate, there's a question of do you have the capabilities to manage research functions? And this is a set of research functions, partly coming from the report, but basically these are sort of the full cycle of research functions from how do you do research and development prioritization, prioritization of other epidemic-related research. Then there's the funding commissioning, to the ethical review, the conduct, the analysis, interpretation, how do you communicate that? Then there's legal arrangements around intellectual property rights, who gets to make money off of this, and access to products, as well as the regulation of the products that come out and the translation to policy. So these are sort of the full set of research functions that you need to incorporate into epidemic response, and you want to have leadership in them. There are built-in conflicts, though, and the idea is that, which highlighted in the report, is that you probably should not be doing certain things that are in conflict with the other, and I'll come to that in just a moment. But during the epidemic, what was observed is that WHO led a prioritization effort, and there's lots of difficulties with doing that because obviously that should have been done ahead of time with candidate candidate vaccines, etc. It also commissioned research, and unusually, because this is not what usually happens when you play that role, they did human subjects ethical review. They were part of implementation, actually led one study implementation, analyzing its results, and Jerry told you about one of the trials and its result. Well, that's actually the trial that they were involved in, and communication of results and policy decisions, and then access to products. They were involved in all of those. So I think the question moving forward, if we're going to learn something, and how can we have a more balanced leadership roles? How do you create this? So I have just 2 slides left, and this one is a bit difficult, but basically this is the list of all of those research leadership functions around which you need governance. This is the same list over here, so it's like a correlation matrix, so you only have to look at one half of it. And basically what we should be asking is, do we have the capabilities and do we have the right balance of accountabilities to be able to do these things? So for example, if you are funding and commissioning, should you be doing ethical review, conduct, and analysis of the research? Typically, the answer is no in research. And that's similarly, if you're conducting the research, well, then you shouldn't be deciding about who gets the intellectual property and regulating it. So these are issues that we would say going forward as you develop governance arrangements, there's a systematic approach that can be taken in terms of helping to decide both around capabilities and as well as which are in conflict. So the red ones I've highlighted here in terms of ones that typically are in conflict. There are also ones in which during the Ebola outbreak, WHO played all of those roles. Now, just to lead off, how can we do better? Well, I think our message is going back to the report, but we do need to engage a broad range of stakeholders for a global coordination mechanism. We need to seek agreement on the goals. We need to develop the mechanisms that address both this network structure as well as the balance of interest, powers, ideology, accountabilities, and develop the principles and processes for moving forward. And I think that there's things that we can do, we can discuss them later, that would help that together, not just convening, but certain analysis that would help us to be able to do that kind of thing better. And then in terms of having that stakeholders together, we need to really prepare to the working group or the sets of working groups that you would have available and standing procedures to be able to have the rapid response research work group for the next outbreak. So I think that there is a lot that we can do. This is as I say, a work in progress, and we're hoping that the report and further discussion, meetings like this, will help us as we move forward to be better prepared and be able to more rapidly and effectively respond to the next major threat to public health and emerging infectious diseases in particular. So thanks very much.
So now all of us can
So
move
what
up
should
here.
do we?
The CGD staff is helping with the.
Oh, I'm sorry. I can. Oh yeah. Oh, okay.
Oops. Thanks, ladies.
I think you're here, right?
Great. So we're now entering a more interactive phase of this meeting. People who are online, who are watching the live streamed version of this, should know that you can submit questions via Twitter at CGDEV, and you should use the hashtag #CGDTalks. Talks with an S on the end. I'm now going to ask our two invited panelists, Carrie Teicher and Jeremy Konyndyk, to comment. We'll start with Carrie. Carrie, the Médecins Sans Frontières has been mentioned several times during the talk, and I in particular I want to hear your reactions. You and I share the fact that we both served in the Peace Corps in West Africa. I in Burkina Faso, you in Mali,
Neighbors.
I noticed. So we were neighbors in that sense. And I know that your long experience in developing countries and in crisis situations, and also in leading part of the research effort at MSF, gives you a unique insight here. So I'm wondering if you could respond. And one particular thing I'm hoping you'll speak to a little bit is those red squares in the penultimate slide that David presented, where he was talking about potential conflicts that became apparent, became manifest during the Ebola outbreak from the organizational structure, which had WHO doing essentially everything.
Great. Thanks, Mead, and thank you for having me and MSF here for today. We always are happy to be part of the discussion, especially when it comes about the experience that we've had. So first, also the caveat that I'm speaking from the MSF perspective and MSF's experience, and very much speaking from my personal experience as a medical epidemiologist, so both as a physician and a scientist, but in the field of humanitarian medicine and the field in which MSF works. So one thing to start off and say is that MSF, we internally have, I'd say, internal capacity and internal institutions that conduct operational research, clinical research, and epidemiology, and in a humanitarian context. And we've had this experience for over 2 decades. On a different scale than some other institutions, but it's definitely there. And so there's this capacity to do this, but we also, at the very base of it, MSF is a medical humanitarian aid organization. So we think and applaud the idea of continuing to do research. However, we think you also have to clearly have, as stated in your report, the care and treatment has to be there as well, and that's not for us even a discussion to kind of start upon. And we think you can have a clinical research agenda around therapeutics, vaccines, diagnostics, and we applaud that effort, but we also think you need to have a research agenda around operational research questions, public health, and clinical care, because delivering clinical care in a PPE, be it collecting data physically by writing in a pen or trying to treat a patient on the ground, that needs to be looked into as well. So then kind of building on that from our MSF experience, I'd like to also state, which was stated with David by earlier, is that the next epidemic is now, right? That in the report, there's a lot of discussion about an inter-epidemic period and an epidemic period. Granted, not at the scale of which we saw in the Ebola 2014-2015 Ebola epidemic is occurring today, but we talk about, right, there's Hep E in Niger in 2017. Last year, there's yellow fever in Angola, meningitis C this year in Nigeria, and again, this year there was Ebola in DRC. So for us, as a medical humanitarian aid organization, we just like to make sure to point out that on the ground, the realities are that the next epidemic is here. Another point we would like to also find, as reflecting from the report, is that we think that the scope of the 2014-2015 West African Ebola epidemic was unique in some sense, and we should be cautious or at least recognize the problems of extrapolating that experience to all future clinical research or other future events in which to engage in, which speaks, I think, a little bit to our point of later that I'll briefly touch on in terms of the needs for flexibility. We also, though, as MSF, from earlier the earlier parts of the presentation, you heard that we did and definitely had contentions with the WHO at the time in the field. That's well known, correct? But we would like to also really reaffirm the convening legitimacy of the WHO in terms of norm setting, and really want to include the WHO's R&D blueprint as a step in the right direction. We think it reaffirms, and we'd like to reaffirm, WHO's role and value in this process, and the need to continue to fund them to be able to do that work. And kind of really circulating back again to what we discuss as well is that as MSF, we're a medical humanitarian aid organization. So if hypothesis testing is done in our fields, we want to ensure that it should be beneficial to our patients. If the tools can't be used in our context, we're not sure why testing in there and having those questions in that context makes sense. And that gives us to our example more recently of the Merck vaccine, right? So it's not a thermostabilized vaccine. It's something like negative 60 degrees centigrade is in which it has to be kept in, which that even putting aside the very large and separate discussion of regulatory issues of that it was available and that we were able to use it, we couldn't use it in rural DRC this past year, even if we were able to from the regulatory stance, because you can't get something that needs to be in a negative 60 degrees centigrade, Celsius, non-thermostabilized vaccine to the context where we work. So it needs to be appropriate as well. So when we look at the report, we look about not only what's missing, but also some key messages that we think should be amplified. So discussions on norms, priority setting, standard setting, we would like to reiterate, but then really talk about issues of flexibility, right? So phase 3 trials are rare and difficult to forecast. If we think about it in terms of the vaccine trials, right, in terms of Ebola vaccine trials very specifically, they would have had different protocols depending on the vaccine candidate, the target population, the number of doses, the known data, and a preset protocol, as discussed perhaps in the report, might have been more constraining than liberating or fast-track ability at that time. However, we'd also like to say that we think that protocols and ethical guidelines for specific clinical trials, for specific therapeutics, specific vaccines, specific diagnostics, should be put in place beforehand, because from this experience, it's very clear from our experience that you can't do that during the epidemic. Our next other key message point is accessibility. We need to ensure that the technology, be it vaccine, therapeutics, diagnostics even, are affordable, appropriate, and available. And that's from that last Merck example, but that's really some of our key messages as well moving forward. I talked about standard setting briefly, and last really from the comment before about involving affected communities as well. I think that we need to think about the role of both national and local governments, as well as local communities, not only in participating or being a part of the discussion, but also being part in defining research priorities. The argument that the epidemiological, shift curve happened because of changes in behavior practices, burial practices, and it was largely driven by the community isn't something that we should ignore. And thinking about it in terms from MSF and our experience, to say I wrote the number down here. Right, so there were about 40, at the peak of the epidemic, there were about 4,300 MSF staff working in our Ebola treatment centers and in our Ebola response. Out of those over 4,300 staff, 4,000 of them were national staff. So we as MSF, though we are an international humanitarian aid organization, our staff are part of the community, and we are part of the community. And so for us, it has really, it reiterates us very close to home about ensuring that the affected communities are involved in the conversation.
Wow, you really spoke to the key issues there, Carrie, and I appreciate your participating. Let's go to Jeremy now. Jeremy had the responsibility of directing a large part of the United States response to the Ebola epidemic from his position at USAID at the time. I think the United States Agency for International Development, as I understand it, was responsible for a large proportion of all the financing of the external response and also of the support. And I would say that Jeremy also attempted to, if I can use the word, orchestrate and coordinate a lot of the American response and perhaps even some of the coordination between the U.S. Agents and those people who are working supported by France and from other countries. So Jeremy comes to this with a lot of experience at trying to really deal with how to get that humanitarian support out there. But I think, Jeremy, you also probably saw some of this tension between the need to do research at the same time that the humanitarian services were supported. And I'm hoping you can speak to how hard that was for you and whether this report, if it had been available back in 2013, would have helped.
Sure. Thanks, Mead. And so as Mead said, I ran the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance at USAID during the Ebola outbreak, and we were tasked with managing the U.S. emergency response to the outbreak in very close partnership, particularly with CDC and the U.S. military. So I come at this from the operational side of things. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a scientist. But I have a long career in humanitarian field operations. I also now serve on the oversight panel that WHO established after the Ebola outbreak to supervise the implementation of their post-Ebola reforms and the management of some of those new structures. So I'm also seeing this a bit from that vantage point. This is an extremely important issue because we were very fortunate in an odd way, in Ebola, that we had the tools at the outset of the outbreak that we needed to contain it. But it was a very close call. We came very close to seeing this outbreak go even more completely out of control to a point where it's hard to imagine how it ever could have been contained without doing dramatically more damage than it did. So we didn't, in the end, need some of these research products that came out, that did eventually emerge, in order to contain the outbreak. But we very nearly could have, had it been worse. And it's very easy to imagine, and I think we have to expect that sometime in the next 50 years, we will see an outbreak in the world, maybe much sooner than that, where the tools available to us at the outset will not be enough to contain it, and we will need to have real-time medical innovation to deploy in order to defeat the pathogen. And so this is a very, very important and very pertinent issue. One of the big challenges in any emergency response, and certainly in some future epidemic response, is bandwidth, just basic bandwidth. And the report is I think it's interesting to see some of the points of convergence around what this report identifies as success factors for a real-time research effort, and what we were seeing as success factors for the overall response writ large. And that's where bandwidth becomes really, really important, because everyone, the researchers, the operators, the communities, the health providers, they're all kind of jockeying in the same space. And everyone's got finite bandwidth. And so if you need, the report talks about the importance of figuring out the legal and the ethical parameters with the host government and the host authorities. Well, those host government authorities are also charged with a million other things. So getting this onto their radar screen is going to have to jockey for space. In the case of West Africa, this was a real issue, because NIH wanted to send in research teams. USAID had an emergency response team on the ground. CDC had a large emergency response presence on the ground. And just one very basic example of how this would play out. The embassy in country has to manage all of these different visitors, and it could be difficult for the ambassador would sometimes be a little bit skeptical of, why do we need yet another U.S. government agency showing up to do something that, okay, they're going to do medical research, and that doesn't, how important is that? So these are some of the realities that, I mean, this kind of a report is important in highlighting to an ambassador, say, well, this is why it's really important that you give country clearance to the NIH team so they can come in and do the research. One problem we had at the outset of the Ebola outbreak was that the public health specialists and the medical specialists and the humanitarian specialists really didn't have much of a common language or a common operating platform. MSF has that because it's inherent to the nature of the organization. The US government didn't have that, and more broadly, most of the humanitarian field didn't have that. And so that's, I think, one of the important aspects of what they're proposing here with this ICS, I think you called it, begins to establish those touch points, that connective tissue between the emergency operators and the public health specialists and the scientists, so that when it's go time, the relationships that need to be in place are in place, the common language exists, and there's much more interoperability. We didn't have much interoperability of that kind at the outset of the outbreak. With that sort of context in mind, a few things that I would highlight that the report talked about, and then one thing that I didn't see a lot of in the report, but I think is quite important. So the first, community engagement. Obviously an important issue for doing research, but an important issue for the response writ large, a fundamental issue, the fundamental issue for the response writ large. And there will inevitably be challenges doing specific community engagement on research amidst a much larger community engagement push that is fundamental to the success of the response. And those things will need to be mapped very, very closely together. There were problems in the early days of the response with just massive confusion about what the disease was, how do you protect yourself, what do you do. Getting a very clear and consistent message and establishing a clear and consistent authority, a trusted authority that's transmitting those messages is very important. There were interesting differences across the three countries in the level of community awareness and the level of the types of community behavior you saw. And some of that had to do with how trusted the government was and how effective the government was. And we saw, interestingly, some much better uptake of some of the key messages at community level in Liberia than we saw in Sierra Leone or we saw in Guinea. And that had to do in part with the population's trust of those governments and the population's trust of the particular avenues through which they were being engaged. So dropping another element into that can disrupt some of that balance, and it can affect the credibility of the interlocutors. So that needs to be very carefully handled.
What do you mean by another element?
So dropping like a research element into that. So you want to really just hammer on these core messages of how you prevent this from spreading in your community. How do you protect yourself? Part of the core messaging is, if you are, the only way to protect yourself, the only way to protect you and your community, or the best way, is that you have to get people to an ETU. They have to be isolated, and talking about what the treatment entails, and research is inherently an unknown in that, right? We're going to treat some of you with this. We're not going to treat others of you with it. I mean, how do you explain an RCT? How do you map the explanation of an RCT process into that core community mobilization messaging? I think is potentially pretty delicate and needs to be very carefully handled.
Would you say it's impossible?
No, I don't know that it's impossible. I mean, it was done, right?
It was proven to be possible.
It's possible,
There you go.
but very delicate and very difficult. And again, I think my point is it needs to be mapped very closely within that overarching community outreach, because if it's done siloed or separately, it's going to just create confusion. Also struck in the report by the highlight on patient data and the difficulties with good patient data, and that was a huge problem for us in the operational response. The data was terrible at the outset. People could be counted at one time as a case when they were first identified in the community. They could be counted the second time as a case when they were admitted to the clinic, and potentially a third time if they were transferred to another clinic, or a third time when they were if they passed away and were buried. So you could have one case because of poor track. Initially it was impossible to track people consistently across different centers and avenues. And that made the numbers very, very difficult to track, and that in turn made the response very difficult, because a response like this that moves so quickly and so fluidly, you need to have good real-time information and understanding, good real-time visibility on how the disease is moving, so that you know how to orient your response resources appropriately. And we didn't have that at the outset. You need that as well, because you're projecting out what this disease might do based on what you think it's doing now. But if you don't have a good picture of what it's doing now, it's very hard to predict what it's going to do and thus to plan. So huge issue for the operational response, and so interesting to see how it's manifesting in this in this issue. The challenge is, how do you get a good data management architecture in a very low tech, very very difficult operating environment, complicated logistics, unreliable power sources, and so on. And just spitballing in real time a bit here, I think there's some fascinating work that's been done with biometrics in other humanitarian contexts. So using biometric registration for refugee arrivals, for example, which can be done in a very self-contained way in very hostile environments. That may have some applicability here, but that, in any case, it's an area, whether that's the solution, this is an area we need a lot of progress and innovation, because it was such a handicap in the early days of the response. And it wasn't until Hans Rosling went out and took a few, we volunteered him a few US military personnel to just do data entry. And he and those soldiers and several Liberian counterparts just sat in an office in Monrovia and scrubbed the data. And that's when we started to get a much more accurate picture of what this outbreak actually looked like. So a ton of work needs to be done there.
Yeah. Let's move now to the general discussions. I want to give a chance to both Jerry and David to say one or two sentences only, please, because we still want to leave time for questions, but in response to these sets of comments.
I think we're in general agreement with the points that are made. The issue for us now is as I said, let's go from words and thinking to taking some action. The time is now. It is true that there are outbreaks and epidemics going on all the time. It is one of the scale. This is a time when you can actually have these kinds of conversations.
Yeah, I don't have much to add except that we're in agreement on the basic principles, and really it's now about what the next steps are, and I think it is the point about needing to have flexibility in the design is absolutely critical, and I think you highlighted also the importance of what is the research agenda. It's not just R&D and not just production, but it's really some of the downstream access, but also some of the other epidemic-related research that needs to be done that's been really kept behind. And I think there's an opportune time to address those issues.
So I just want to emphasize something that Jeremy said that resonates with me because of my long experience now in looking at the economics of the HIV/AIDS response. And that is this idea of patient identifiers. One of the biggest challenges in managing the HIV/AIDS response, which is of course on a much different time frame over years or decades rather than only weeks as it was for Ebola. But one of the biggest problems is that the same patient gets counted multiple times and gets missed. When they change from one treatment site to another, they get missed. When they identify as HIV positive, and then so we don't actually have as good information as we'd like with respect to whether patients are successfully making it through the entire treatment cascade. And so this issue of a patient identifier strikes me as a common theme with this. And I'm wondering if Carrie and Jerry and David would agree that as part of the technical fix that can be prepared now as we prepare for the next epidemic, that strengthening patient identifier systems in country is a necessary foundational step in order to prepare for the next outbreak. So, Jerry, how do you feel about that?
That's basic public health and health system. I think it's absolutely essential. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no argument.
And Carrie, how do you feel about it?
I think the answer for us is yes, except I think that a little bit on the biometrics identification. As a humanitarian aid organization, we kind of step away from a little bit. And by a little bit, I mean a lot.
So you agree that it would help you with your epidemiology and your humanitarian tracking of patients, but you're worried about some of the ethical implications.
Exactly.
Yeah. So if those ethical implications could be effectively addressed, then you'd feel more comfortable.
Exactly. If you can mitigate that end of it, I think we'd be.
And which is why you need the engagement from community and community leaders. And
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I'm not sure exactly how much time we have, but let's start to take some questions from the audience. And also, Roxanne, if you have some questions on Twitter, please let us know. Okay. This lady in the front.
My name is Deirdre Lepin. I'm an anthropologist converted to a public health practitioner. I did my degree in the Department of International Health at Johns Hopkins. In the days before it underwent what I would call the social awareness revolution and became the Bloomberg School. So I'm very happy to hear so much discussion about the importance of community, social awareness, et cetera, et cetera. There's one role that I did not hear mentioned by anyone in this fascinating and very thoughtful presentation, and that is the role of the anthropologist. Mm-hmm. And I would say the anthropologist with a capital A, because that would be a key role in the area of prevention, a key role in the area of stakeholder engagement, a key role in the area of mediation between the different actors and also between the researchers and the community to make the research possible. So I would hope to see at some point that the anthropologist becomes a key player in this process.
Okay, let's collect two more questions and then turn it over to the panel. Two more questions? Can we get two more questions? If not, the anthropology question is going to be featured. Okay, I'm very curious myself, given the importance of burial practices. We have one more? Okay, yeah. And then OC. That'll give us a total of three.
Sophie Edwards from Devex. My question is about US government funding for research, which seems to be on the decline, and with the proposed axing of some of the NIH departments are focused on that. So do you think there'll be an appetite for this kind of work that you're proposing?
Good question. And Ak, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Ak Pennenberg. I used to be with the World Bank and still interested in these fields. I used to sit on several bodies of research coalitions, global research coalitions. Now that's what you've proposed for this very ambitious program. Could you maybe comment on some of the lessons learned from these kind of research coalitions? It's not for the first time, right? So I would be interested
Do
how
I
you would
detect
look
a
at
note
that.
of skepticism, Ak?
Well, you can hear the tone of my voice, right?
Okay, so the role of anthropologists, I'd really be curious, none of you did, nor did I mention that word, the funding possibilities going forward, and some skepticism about David's very, very ambitious plans for international collaboration. Yeah.
Well,
Go
I
ahead,
could-
no, start.
Well, the anthropologists, I think, have a critical role to play. And in fact, during the outbreak, the anthropology platform proved itself to be very useful and as a leading part of what is part of the community engagement. So I would say that having that standing anthropology platform, and it's not just anthropologists. I think there's ethnographers and sociologists that are involved in the whole social science aspect as part of it. And I would say that that's one of the questions in terms of the broader, what is the research agenda, because I think there are huge questions on the applied research that it plays in terms, and as well as the actual programming. It's not strictly a research, it's actually an important part of the community engagement approaches. And rapid anthropological approaches to assessment engagements were critical to the response, and that's what Liberia did early on. I would say that it's also important in terms of there are some groups working on the anthropology of an accountability space as well. And I would say that some of that research is particularly needed in terms of looking at some accountability mapping and accountability ecosystems that would help us as we move forward. Now that's more organizational than individual, so it's really crossing disciplines really. But I think some of the same types of methods and tools would be useful both at the global level for the global mechanism as well as the practice and research around the response. Just quickly to Ak, he was formerly my boss, so...
Why don't we take that separately?
Okay.
So I just wanted to make one point, and I think you wanted to chime in as well. So as you can imagine, for these kinds of clinical trials on therapeutics and vaccines, the expertise was coming from outside of West Africa and at high-level research organizations. It was interesting that at the beginning, they really hadn't heard about social mobilization and community engagement and why you really needed to make those connections. And once that started to happen, things began to move. And in fact, we said in the course of the presentation that, in fact, randomized controlled trials could be done, but only when the community was engaged and understood what the rationale was. So this connection is as intimate as could be and has to be done better.
Would you say that a key requirement is that community understand the depth of the ignorance in the medical community about what really works?
There's lots of therapeutic misconceptions, I'm
not saying that the community itself had misconceptions. I'm saying that I would think that for the community to endorse an RCT and the concept of an RCT, they would have to be convinced actually that there is no cure. Currently, there's no cure. And if they understand that you're trying to, that the best people in the world don't know how to fix this, that might be sort of the first step.
Do you want to talk about the early messaging?
Go ahead. I think that's rather important.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be difficult to assume that because what we found was a lot of the early messaging that did not work was around Ebola kills, and that really...
And there's no hope.
And there's no, right, developed a sense of hopelessness, and that undermined both the response and the research. So I'd say it's really, really around the therapeutics of hope and understanding some of the constraints to that is the approach that I think turned more useful.
And that was one of the issues that led families to hide the patients,
Okay.
which led to more transmission, obviously.
Yeah.
There was a very telling moment. We had one of our open meetings in Monrovia, and one of the senior clerics in Liberia, who got engaged in this sort of late in the fall of 2014, when they discovered community engagement, social mobilization kinds of thing. So he said that in addressing his congregation and talking about safe burial, very traditional religion, hands-on, the touching, all of the things that exposed people. He said, when Christ talked about the laying on of hands, he didn't necessarily mean skin to skin. And you can lay on hands at a safe distance. And suddenly the acceptance of the safer burial practices turned around. And it's those kinds of insights and messages that need to be there from the very beginning. So when we call for what is, quote, inter-epidemic period, this is the time now to get that conversation going. Some of the lead researchers in this field said, well, we'd never heard about social mobilization. It's a new concept to us. Duh. Now's the time to make that connection happen.
Well, it's fair to say I've never heard accountability ecosystem pronounced, those two words pronounced together before today. So
It's a whole field.
It's all moving forward. Yeah, Carrie, on the anthropology.
Just briefly of saying that, I didn't mention that, but MSF conducted a lot of operational and applied research during the epidemic, both in the beginning when we kind of heard deafening silence from our colleagues in national, international, across the board of not there in the field, but when we were in the field and when others joined us as well, is that a lot, and including most certainly with anthropologists who helped deliver some of our key community messaging and some of the research, that core research, in which enabled us to get patients to treatment and contact tracing.
And I think the role and the importance of anthropology is really well recognized now coming out of this. Anytime you hear social mobilization, community engagement, you're talking about a role for exactly that function and the reinforcement, the importance of that. And I know that amongst the reforms that WHO is now carrying out is also building more of that capability into the WHO emergency response section. Just quickly on the funding, I think it remains to be seen yet what will actually happen. I mean, there have been cuts that have been proposed by the White House that are incredibly irresponsible and would be incredibly damaging. I'm not a U.S. government employee anymore, so I can say that. So, I mean, really deeply irresponsible. What is encouraging is those cuts have not gotten a lot of traction in Congress, and of course it's Congress that will ultimately write the budget. And so I think there's some reasonable hope to hold out that some of the more damaging things that have been proposed will not make it through the congressional appropriations process.
It's hard to have that level of confidence in Congress based on past performance, but I think there have been some strong signals. In fact, when the president's budget proposed reducing NIH for this fiscal year, for the remainder of this fiscal year, by $1 billion, Congress increased it by $2 billion.
Yeah.
And that increase in $2 billion is the set point. If there's a continuing resolution for next year, the budget is now $2 billion more than it was a little while ago. So one of the things that we are trying to do as a committee, we're not getting into politics, but raising issues and in constituencies and in the public to respond to and challenge U.S. government policies that are being proposed and sometimes implemented. We need to raise the alarm. We need to get the larger community in agreement that our health is tied to the health of people elsewhere, and that global health is relevant to us. And that's part of what we're trying to do in disseminating the issues around this report and activities that the National Academies can do. It's not an implementing organization. It's not going to be in the field with you and taking care of patients. But it has some substance, and trying to get that out there in this slice of the response agenda is part and parcel of what we're trying to do.
And the cost benefit on that spending is so incredibly compelling, because if you look again at Ebola, by having a slow response that didn't have much in the way of therapeutic tools or vaccine tools ready, the U.S. government had to spend $5 billion to prepare for and respond, both prepare on the home front and respond in West Africa to this crisis. And that is an awful lot of money. And that is a very small amount of money compared to what it would, what the nation would have to spend in the case of a truly deadly pandemic that probably will emerge at some point. So this sort of research spending pales in comparison to what we would have to spend in a crisis scenario and helps to avert those crisis scenarios.
We said that in the report succinctly, pay now or pay a lot more later.
Absolutely.
And the pay a lot more later is not just the treasure and money, but it's deaths and morbidity and
Absolutely.
economic consequences that have huge implications.
Yeah.
I wanted to respond to Ock's point as well about the research consortium or coalitions, because I don't see this as a research consortium. This is something that is different. This is about an integration of response and research, and that's different set of players, and we haven't done this before, not at the global level. And so, what makes a collaboration and network work, is the same kinds of principles around how do you add value and looking at commonality of goals and the kind of things we talked about, in terms of recognizing different interests and matching accountabilities. Once you start losing that, you lose the legitimacy, you lose the trust, you lose the ability to add value. So I think that's why we're trying to be more explicit about what are the things that you really have to take care of, understand, and go in with your eyes open, rather than just saying, that, it'll take care of itself, or that, you let industry do some things and we'll, combat it on the other side with government. We really need a new type of approach, and I think we go into it with our eyes open and looking for that, looking for the data around how do we add value.
So let me just, on this last point, with the WHO monadic system, with a single institution responsible for the entire chain of functions that you identified so clearly, we at least know who screwed up, right? Now, what worries me with respect to the proposal is that your accountability ecosystem may not allow us to even know that. So I'm wondering, and I guess it would allow us to know that if the accountability part really works.
Right.
So it looks to me as if what they're proposing is a more inclusive system, one which involves multiple entities in a more peer-to-peer network sort of arrangement. But in peer-to-peer networks in information technology, there are accountability systems that hold each peer accountable. And I'm wondering what you have in mind. How actually would you have a network system with accountability?
Right. I think it's a question of balancing the accountabilities and making them explicit. I don't think that, the problem with having a single hierarchy is that we haven't invested and don't have the capabilities to have both the capacity and to deal with the conflicts, because there are inbuilt conflicts. You do not want the funder, the commissioner, being the one who's telling you what the results are, and doing the ethical clearance. It's just not. You get confused messages, and you get the wrong messages,
And you get suspicion from outside.
Exactly. So you lose that trust. So I think that I'm not talking about sort of a just a loose market, with no restrictions on it. There need to be real accountabilities for who is actually going to invest in developing the new products. Who's going to insure against the financial loss? How do you make sure? Do you actually track of what happens to the profits? Who actually gets access to the new vaccines and drugs? You can do that through a lot of transparency. It doesn't happen on its own, and so I think you do need to make, if you have those set of functions, I would do it around, responsibility for functions. You can still have WHO and should still have WHO leading the international call to arms and the response and activating the network in terms of the epidemic response. I think that that's clear, and we haven't nearly invested enough in making that work. But I think, just by the way, in the international health regulations, there is a co-responsibility for national governments to do a lot, and they have failed,
Also.
terribly. So it's not like there is ever a single responsibility. It's just that we need to be more creative and inclusive in terms of how we bring them together. And what we've lacked is actually balancing independence. And so we've by putting it all in one boat, by being, that the same agent is the soccer player, the referee, the person in the stands, and the commissioner running the league, and the ball. You get a boring game, and it doesn't work very well, right, in terms of its purpose.
Unless you're the ball.
So I think unfortunately, it's time to wrap up. And I want to thank all of our participants, all 4 of you, for coming. And we're glad to be able to help in the dissemination of this important National Academies report. And we hope that actually pandemic preparedness is going to be a continuing priority for the international global health community and for this administration here in Washington, D.C. We think this report is points out some of the reasons why we need to prepare now, not wait for the next Ebola epidemic, and also gives us some pathways, some directions in which we can move, and we need to do that fast. So thanks to all of you.
Thank you.
Nice to put together. It's nice.